The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen tile the moment I heard my wife say the word, servant, through the half-open door, and for 5 years I had given up my job, my friends, and every ounce of sleep to keep her alive, and in that single second I understood that love and gratitude are not always the same thing. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet kind of hope that survives even our worst days, I want to ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a reminder that people can change, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this one belong to all of us, and our community grows stronger every time we choose to believe in second chances. My name is Thomas Whitfield, and before any of this happened, I was an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a small town outside Portland, Oregon, where the rain fell more often than the sun and the trees turned every shade of gold each October. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized engineering firm, the kind of job that paid the mortgage and let me take my wife out for dinner on Fridays. Her name was Margaret, though everyone who loved her called her Meg, and she had a laugh that used to fill up a room the way sunlight fills a window. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's wedding, and within a year we were married ourselves, standing under a canopy of birch trees with fewer than 40 guests, promising each other the kind of forever that young couples promise without ever truly understanding the weight of the word. For the first 8 years of our marriage, life moved the way it moves for most people. We bought a modest house with a crooked porch step that we always meant to fix and never did. We adopted a golden retriever named Biscuit who slept at the foot of our bed and greeted every stranger like a long-lost friend. We talked about children but never quite got there, first because of my job, then because of hers, and eventually because life simply kept moving forward without asking our permission. Meg worked as a high school art teacher, and she had this way of talking about her students that made you feel like you knew each of them personally: the shy boy who could draw hands better than anyone she'd ever taught, the girl who painted only in blues because she said happiness felt too loud. I loved listening to her talk about her days. I loved watching her hands move when she got excited about an idea. I loved her, plainly and completely, in the unremarkable way that people love each other when nothing has yet tested that love. The testing began on a Tuesday in March, 5 years before the day the coffee cup broke on our kitchen floor. Meg had been tired for weeks, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix, and she'd noticed a small lump beneath her collarbone that she almost didn't mention to her doctor because she assumed it was nothing: a swollen gland, a strained muscle, the ordinary noise of a body that was busy living. The doctor didn't think it was nothing. 2 weeks and several tests later, we sat together in an office with beige walls and a box of tissues placed a little too deliberately on the corner of the desk, and a doctor named Dr. Ellison told us that Meg had stage 3 non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system that had already spread further than anyone wanted it to. I remember very little of what was said after that. I remember the sound of the clock on the wall, absurdly loud in the silence. I remember Meg's hand finding mine and gripping it so hard her knuckles went white. I remember driving home in complete silence, both of us staring straight ahead as though looking at each other would make the diagnosis more real than it already was. That night, we sat on our back porch with Biscuit lying between us, and Meg finally cried, not the delicate crying of movies but the raw, heaving kind that comes from somewhere beneath the ribs, and I held her and told her that whatever happened, I was not going anywhere. I meant it with every fiber of my being. I had no idea, in that moment, how many different ways a person could be tested to prove they meant something. The next 5 years reorganized every part of our lives around a single question: how do we keep Meg alive? I requested a leave of absence from my job that eventually became a full resignation, because chemotherapy schedules do not care about quarterly deadlines, and someone needed to drive her to Providence Cancer Center 3 times a week, sit with her through 6-hour infusions, and be there afterward when the nausea hit so hard she could barely lift her head off the pillow. I learned things I never wanted to learn. I learned how to flush a port catheter without flinching. I learned which foods she could keep down on her worst days and which ones would send her running to the bathroom. I learned to recognize the particular gray tint her skin took on when her white blood cell count dropped too low, and I learned the phone numbers of 3 different oncology nurses by heart because I called them so often in the middle of the night, asking whether a fever of 100.4 degrees was something to worry about or something to simply monitor. Our savings dwindled faster than either of us wanted to admit. Insurance covered a portion of the treatment, but the portion it did not cover ate through the money we had set aside for a future we no longer dared to plan too far in advance. I sold my truck, the one I had bought used in my 20s and always loved, because we needed the money more than I needed to feel like the man I used to be. I picked up freelance consulting work whenever Meg was stable enough to be left alone for a few hours, working from the corner of our bedroom with my laptop balanced on my knees, glancing up every few minutes to check that she was still breathing evenly in her sleep. Friends drifted away slowly, the way friends do when a crisis stretches past the point where casseroles and sympathy cards feel adequate. Some people simply cannot stay close to suffering for years at a time, and I understood that even as it hurt, because I hadn't understood it myself until I was living inside it. There were good stretches, mercifully. There was a remission that lasted 14 months, during which Meg's hair grew back in soft brown curls she'd never had before the treatment, and we took a short trip to the Oregon coast where she stood at the edge of the water with her arms outstretched like she was trying to hug the whole horizon, and for a little while we let ourselves believe the worst was behind us. But the cancer returned, as it so often does with this particular disease, and this time it fought harder and required more aggressive treatment, including a stem cell transplant that meant weeks of isolation in a hospital room where I sat in a plastic chair by her bed for so many consecutive days that the nurses started bringing me coffee without being asked. I lost 20 pounds that year, not from any deliberate effort but simply because eating felt like one more task on a list that never got shorter. I stopped recognizing my own face in mirrors sometimes, not because it had aged so dramatically, though it had aged, but because the man looking back at me seemed to be running on something other than sleep and food, something closer to pure will. Through all of it, I told myself that this was what love looked like when it was tested. I told myself that vows were not meant for the easy years, that, in sickness and in health, was not a poetic flourish but an actual promise, one I intended to keep even when keeping it cost me nearly everything I had once considered mine. I did not do it because I expected gratitude. I did it because I loved her, and because the version of myself that could walk away from a suffering wife was not a version of myself I could have lived with. But I would be lying if I said some small, human part of me didn't need to hear, every once in a while, that she saw what I was doing. That she knew what it cost. The lymphoma finally went into full remission a little over a year before the day everything changed, and the doctors used words like excellent prognosis and no evidence of disease, words we had waited 5 years to hear without daring to fully believe them. Meg's energy returned in slow, uneven waves. She started painting again in our garage, which she'd converted into a small studio during her healthier stretches, filling canvases with the kind of loose, joyful color she hadn't touched in years. She went back to substitute teaching a few days a week, just enough to feel like herself again without overwhelming a body that was still finding its footing. I started rebuilding my freelance consulting into something closer to a real career again, taking on clients I'd had to turn away during the worst years. Slowly, carefully, we began to imagine a future again, the way people do after they've walked through fire and come out the other side singed but standing. It was during this fragile, hopeful season that Meg's college friend Dana came to visit for a long weekend. Dana lived in Seattle and had known Meg since their freshman year of art school, long before I ever entered the picture, and the two of them had the kind of friendship that could survive years of distance and pick up mid-sentence every time they reconnected. I liked Dana well enough. She was sharp-tongued and funny in a way that could occasionally sting, but she had shown up for Meg during the darkest stretches of treatment, driving down from Seattle more than once just to sit with her during a bad week, and I respected that kind of loyalty even when Dana's humor rubbed me the wrong way. That Saturday, I had spent the morning fixing the porch step we'd been ignoring for a decade, finally getting around to it now that Meg's health gave us room to breathe again, and I came inside through the side door to grab a fresh bottle of water, my hands still dusty with sawdust. I didn't mean to overhear anything. I want to be clear about that, because I think intentions matter even in moments that end up changing everything. I simply walked toward the kitchen, and the door to the sunroom where Meg and Dana were sitting with their coffee was open just enough for their voices to carry. Dana was laughing about something, and then I heard her ask Meg, in the easy, teasing tone old friends use with each other, whether Thomas ever complained about doing so much for her all these years, whether it ever felt like too much to ask of one person. And I heard Meg laugh too, a small, tired laugh, and say something I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. She said, "Honestly, he's basically been my servant for 5 years. I don't even have to ask anymore, he just does it." I stood frozen in our kitchen with a water bottle in my hand, and something inside my chest folded in on itself like paper catching fire. It was not the words themselves, exactly, though the word servant landed like a slap I hadn't seen coming. It was the tone. It was the laughter wrapped around it, casual and light, as though 5 years of my life, 5 years of missed sleep and sold trucks and cancelled friendships and a body that had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid, had been reduced to a punchline between old friends over coffee. I did not go into the sunroom. I did not confront her right there, though every instinct told me to. I simply set the water bottle down on the counter as quietly as I could, and I walked back outside, and I sat down on the porch step I had just finished fixing, and I put my head in my hands and I did not cry, though I wanted to, because something harder and colder than sadness had taken its place. I want to pause here and say something to whoever is watching this, because I know some of you have felt what I felt in that moment. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from cruelty but from carelessness, from discovering that the person you sacrificed everything for has, perhaps without even realizing it, come to see your love as a service rather than a gift. It does not matter whether they meant it maliciously. Sometimes the wound is exactly as deep either way. And if you are in a season right now where you feel unseen by someone you have given everything to, I want you to know that your feelings are valid, and that this story is not going to tell you to simply swallow that pain and keep serving in silence. It is going to tell you something more complicated and, I hope, more true. I did not say anything to Meg that day. I told myself I needed time to think, which was true, but if I am honest, I also did not trust myself to speak without saying something I couldn't take back. I finished the porch railing in silence, said goodbye to Dana with a politeness that felt like it belonged to a stranger wearing my face, and that evening I made dinner as I had made dinner nearly every night for 5 years, and I sat across the table from my wife and I could not stop replaying the word in my head. Servant. I chewed my food and nodded along to whatever she was saying and felt, for the first time in our marriage, a genuine distance opening up between us, not because of the cancer, not because of the exhaustion, but because of a single sentence spoken to someone else when she thought I couldn't hear. Over the following 2 weeks, I withdrew, though I don't think Meg noticed right away, because withdrawal in our house had become such a normal survival mechanism that a little more quiet didn't necessarily stand out. I started saying yes to more freelance projects than I probably should have, staying in my home office later into the evening, telling myself I was rebuilding my career when really I was avoiding the discomfort of sitting in a room with her. I stopped initiating the small tender gestures that had become second nature over 5 years, the shoulder rubs after a long day, the tea made without being asked, the quiet checking in on how she was feeling before she'd even said a word. I did not stop out of spite, not consciously. I stopped because something in me had gone quiet and cautious, the way an animal goes still after being startled, unsure whether it is safe to move forward the way it did before. Meg noticed eventually, of course, because she was not a foolish woman, and 5 years of illness had made her more attuned to shifts in mood and energy than most people ever become in a lifetime. She started asking me, gently at first, whether everything was all right, whether she'd done something, whether I was simply tired from taking on too much freelance work at once. I told her I was fine. I told her this more times than I care to admit, and each time the lie sat heavier in my chest, because I had never lied to her in 5 years of marriage, not about anything that mattered, and here I was lying about the one thing that mattered most. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after I'd overheard her conversation with Dana. Meg had a follow-up scan scheduled that morning, a routine 6-month check to confirm the remission was holding, and I drove her there as I had driven her to hundreds of appointments before, and we sat in the familiar waiting room with its uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines, and she squeezed my hand the way she always did before they called her name, a small ritual we developed without ever discussing it, and something about the familiarity of that gesture, the muscle memory of 5 Years of showing up, cracked something open in me that I hadn't planned to open that day. When we got back in the car afterward, the scan clear, another 6 months of remission confirmed, Meg turned to me with relief written across her whole face and said we should celebrate, maybe order takeout from the Thai place she loved, and I sat there with my hands still on the steering wheel and the engine not yet started, and I said, without planning to say it, I heard what you told Dana. Meg went very still beside me. She asked what I meant, though something in her voice told me she already suspected, and I told her, as evenly as I could manage, though my voice shook more than I wanted it to, that I had heard her call me her servant, that I had heard her laugh about it, that I had been carrying those words around in my chest for 3 weeks like a stone I couldn't put down. I want to tell you honestly that Meg's face, in that moment, did not look defensive or annoyed the way I had braced myself for. It looked stricken. It looked like someone who had just realized, in real time, that a careless word had traveled much further than she ever intended it to. She reached for my hand and I let her take it, though I didn't grip it back the way I usually did, and she said she was so sorry, that it wasn't what she meant, that she had been trying to make a joke, the way people sometimes make jokes about the hardest things in their lives because the alternative is crying about them constantly, and that she had never, not for one single day of the last 5 years, thought of me as anything less than the reason she was still alive. I told her, and this part was harder to say than I expected, that intention mattered less to me in that moment than impact, that whatever she meant by it, what I heard was 5 years of my life being described as servitude, 5 years of choosing her, again and again, every single day, being reduced to something owed rather than something given. I told her about the truck I'd sold and never mentioned missing. I told her about the friendships that had quietly died because I never had the energy to maintain them. I told her about nights I'd stood over her hospital bed too afraid to sleep in case her breathing changed, and how none of that had ever felt like servitude to me because I did it out of love, but hearing her describe it that way to someone else had made me question, for the first time in 5 years, whether she understood the difference. We sat in that parking lot for nearly an hour, the rain streaking down the windshield, and Meg cried in a way I had rarely seen her cry, not the exhausted tears of chemotherapy nausea or the frightened tears of a bad scan result, but the tears of someone confronting a truth about themselves they didn't like. She told me that somewhere in the middle of being sick for so long, she had started to feel like a burden, like a problem that needed managing rather than a person who was loved, and that maybe calling herself demanding and calling me her servant had been some twisted way of making light of a fear she couldn't say out loud, the fear that she had become too much for anyone to love without obligation weighing on it. She said she hadn't realized, until this exact moment, how much that careless joke must have cost me, and she said she understood if I needed time, if I needed distance, if I needed something from her that she didn't yet know how to give. I did need time. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story that could rush toward forgiveness too quickly, and I don't think that would be truthful or fair to anyone watching who has been in a similar position. For the next several weeks, our house held a different kind of quiet than it had during the sickest years, not the exhausted quiet of survival but the careful quiet of two people renegotiating the terms of a life they'd built together. I still made her coffee in the mornings. I still drove her to her follow-up appointments. But I stopped doing it silently, invisibly, the way I had for so long, and instead I started saying things out loud that I had always assumed didn't need saying. I told her when I was tired. I told her when I needed a night to myself. I told her, more than once, that I loved her completely and that loving her had never once felt like a burden, but that I needed her to see the difference between what I gave freely and what she seemed to have started expecting automatically. Meg, to her enormous credit, did not get defensive in the weeks that followed. She started seeing a therapist, something she had resisted throughout most of her treatment because she said she didn't have the energy for one more appointment, one more person poking at her feelings when her body already felt so thoroughly examined. But something about that afternoon in the parking lot had shifted something in her, and she began going every other week to a counselor who specialized in chronic illness and its effect on marriages, and she started coming home from those sessions with a kind of raw honesty I hadn't heard from her in years. She told me about the shame she carried for needing so much help. She told me about the guilt that lived underneath that shame, guilt for the years I'd given up, the career I'd paused, the life I might have had if I'd married someone healthier. She told me that sometimes it was easier to joke about being demanding than to sit with the terror of being truly, deeply dependent on another human being, because dependency had always frightened her, long before the cancer, going back to a childhood where her own mother had left when Meg was 11, teaching her early and painfully that the people you need most can simply walk away. I hadn't known that part of her story in quite that depth before, even after 8 years of marriage before the diagnosis and 5 years of fighting through it together. I had known her mother left. I had not fully understood how deeply that abandonment had shaped the way Meg related to needing anyone, how the small, careless joke to Dana might have been less about undervaluing me and more about Meg protecting herself from the unbearable vulnerability of admitting how completely she relied on someone who could, in theory, decide to leave the way her mother once had. That understanding did not erase the hurt I felt. But it softened it, the way understanding often does, replacing a clean wound of anger with the messier, more complicated ache of compassion. I started going to a few of those therapy sessions with her, not all of them, but enough to sit in the same room while we untangled 5 years of unspoken resentments and unspoken fears that had been quietly accumulating beneath the surface of our daily survival. I learned, in that room, that I had my own version of Meg's pattern, that I had thrown myself so completely into caregiving partly because it gave me a sense of purpose and control in a situation that otherwise felt entirely out of my hands, and that somewhere along the way I had stopped asking for anything for myself because asking felt like it would take energy away from her fight, energy I didn't feel I had the right to redirect. Our therapist, a calm, sharp-eyed woman named Renata, pointed out gently that two people can love each other completely and still build, without meaning to, a relationship where one person's needs quietly disappear beneath the weight of the other's crisis. She said this wasn't a story about a good person and a bad person. It was a story about two people who had survived something enormous and hadn't yet learned how to live inside the survival. Around this same time, something unexpected happened that would end up changing the trajectory of our recovery in a way neither of us anticipated. Meg's father, a stern, quiet man named Walter who had never been particularly demonstrative with his affection, had a minor stroke that left him with weakness on his left side and a newfound, humbling need for help with basic daily tasks. Meg drove out to see him in the small town 2 hours south where he lived alone since her mother's departure decades earlier, and she came home from that visit changed in a way I could see the moment she walked through the door. She told me that watching her father struggle to button his own shirt, watching him grow frustrated and ashamed at needing a home health aide to help him bathe, had cracked something open in her understanding of what it actually feels like to be on the receiving end of care. She said she finally understood, in her body and not just her mind, how much dignity a person has to surrender in order to accept help, and how the people who offer that help without flinching, without resentment, without making the person feel small for needing it, are offering something closer to a miracle than a service. She told me, sitting at our kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, that she thought she finally understood what those 5 years had actually cost me, not in the abstract way she'd always intellectually acknowledged it, but in the visceral, specific way you only understand something after you've stood next to someone else living through it. She said watching her father's home health aide, a patient young woman named Priya who worked 12-hour shifts without a hint of resentment in her voice, had made Meg think about all the ways she had failed to actually see me during her own illness, not because I hadn't been present, but because she had been too sick, too frightened, too consumed by her own survival to notice the person standing beside her giving up pieces of himself every single day. I did not expect that visit to her father to be the turning point it became, but grief and fear have a strange way of clarifying things that comfort never quite manages to. Meg began helping with her father's care on weekends, driving down every other Saturday to give the home health aide a break and to sit with Walter herself, and something about physically doing the work of caregiving, even in small doses, seemed to complete a circuit of understanding that all the therapy sessions in the world hadn't quite finished. She started thanking me for things she had once taken for granted, not in grand dramatic gestures but in small, specific ways that meant more to me than any speech could have. She started noticing when I was tired before I said anything. She started asking about my freelance projects with real curiosity instead of the polite, distracted interest of someone whose attention was elsewhere. She started, in short, seeing me again, the way she used to see me before survival narrowed both our worlds down to the next appointment, the next scan, the next crisis to manage. I want to be honest that forgiveness did not arrive as a single moment for me, the way I think people sometimes expect it to in stories like this one. It arrived in layers, the way most real forgiveness does, built slowly out of 1,000 small proofs that the person asking for it meant what they said. There was the morning I woke up to find Meg had made breakfast before I'd even gotten out of bed, something she almost never did in the mornings because mornings had always been hardest for her energy levels, and she told me, a little sheepishly, that she'd set an alarm early just so she could do it. There was the afternoon she surprised me by calling my old college roommate, a friend I had lost touch with during the worst years of her treatment, and arranged for the two of us to meet for coffee, telling me afterward that she wanted to help me rebuild some of what I had let go of for her sake. There was the evening, months into this slow rebuilding, when she sat me down and told me, without me asking, that she had gone back and told Dana the truth, that she'd corrected the joke, that she'd told her oldest friend plainly that I was not her servant but the reason she was alive, and that she was ashamed it had taken her this long to say it out loud to someone other than me. I think it's important, in telling this story, to acknowledge that not every marriage survives a wound like the one I carried after that overheard conversation, and I don't say that to diminish anyone who has made the difficult, sometimes necessary choice to walk away from a relationship that could not or would not change. Forgiveness is not owed to anyone, and healing a marriage requires both people to do the work, not just the one who was hurt. What made the difference for Meg and me was not that the pain I felt disappeared, because it didn't, not entirely, not even now. What made the difference was that Meg did not ask me to simply get over it. She did not tell me I was being too sensitive, or that I was making too much of a joke told to an old friend. She sat with the discomfort of having hurt someone who had given her everything, and she let that discomfort change her, rather than defending herself against it. About 8 months after that rainy afternoon in the parking lot, Meg asked if we could take a trip back to the Oregon coast, the same stretch of beach where we had gone during her first remission years earlier, the place where she had stood with her arms outstretched toward the horizon as though trying to hold the whole world. We drove out on a clear, cold Saturday in early spring, the kind of Pacific Northwest day where the sun comes out just enough to remind you why people put up with all the rain the rest of the year. We walked along the Titterline with Biscuit, older now and grayer around the muzzle but still delighted by every seagull that crossed his path, and at some point Meg stopped walking and turned to face me, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face, and she told me she wanted to say something she'd been practicing in her head for weeks. She told me that she had spent 5 years fighting to survive her own body, so consumed by that fight that she had let herself believe, somewhere along the way, that survival was the only thing that mattered, that as long as she was alive, everything else would eventually sort itself out. She said she understood now that surviving is not the same as living well, and that a marriage built only on one person's survival and the other person's silent sacrifice was not the marriage she wanted for whatever years they had left together, however many that turned out to be. She told me that she saw me now, fully, in a way she wasn't sure she had ever quite managed before the cancer even started, because before the diagnosis, our lives had been comfortable enough that she'd never had to test what she actually knew about who I was and what I was capable of giving. She said the word servant would probably haunt her for the rest of her life, not because I had made her feel guilty about it, but because it had shown her exactly how much growing she still had to do as a partner, as a person who had been loved more faithfully than she had ever fully earned, and she wanted to spend whatever time she had left trying to earn it properly, one honest day at a time. I told her, standing there on that beach with the cold wind cutting through my jacket and Biscuit barking at something in the distance, that I had never once regretted the last 5 years, not the missed sleep, not the sold truck, not the friendships that faded, because every single sacrifice had been made in service of keeping her alive, and she was alive, standing in front of me, healthy enough to walk along a beach and say hard things out loud instead of avoiding them. I told her that what had broken me wasn't the sacrifice itself but the fear that the sacrifice had gone unseen, that 5 years of my life had been quietly filed away as an obligation rather than recognized as a choice I made freely, over and over, because I loved her more than I had ever loved anything. I told her that hearing her name the truth of it now, on this beach, meant more to me than any apology could have meant on its own, because it told me she finally understood the difference between being served and being loved. We stood there for a long time after that, not saying much of anything, just holding each other while the tide came in around our boots, and I remember thinking that this exact moment, was the marriage I had actually promised all those years ago under the birch trees, not the easy comfortable years before the diagnosis, and not even the desperate survival years during the worst of the treatment, but this, the hard, honest, unglamorous work of two people choosing to see each other clearly. And love each other anyway, even after one of them had said something careless enough to nearly break the other. In the 2 years since that day on the beach, our life has settled into something I never quite dared to imagine during the darkest stretches of Meg's illness. Her scans have remained clear, and while neither of us will ever again take that word, clear, entirely for granted, we have allowed ourselves to build a future around it in cautious, deliberate ways. Meg went back to teaching full-time, and she started something new alongside it, a small after-school art program for kids dealing with apparent serious illness, a project born directly out of everything we learned during our own years of crisis. She named the program after her father, who passed away peacefully about a year after his stroke, with Meg by his side, having spent his final months finally receiving from his daughter the kind of patient, unresentful care he had never quite known how to offer anyone himself. I think that experience, painful as it was, gave Meg something she needed almost as much as her own remission did, the chance to close a circle her own childhood had left open for decades. I eventually built my freelance consulting work back into a full career, and I even reconnected with several of the friendships I had let go of during the hardest years, including my old college roommate, who has since become one of the steadiest presences in my life again, someone who never once made me feel guilty for having disappeared during the years I needed to disappear. Dana still visits several times a year, and I won't pretend that first visit after the parking lot conversation wasn't awkward, because it was, deeply so, but Dana turned out to be exactly the kind of friend I hoped she was, someone humble enough to apologize sincerely for a joke she hadn't fully understood the weight of, and someone who has since gone out of her way, in small consistent gestures, to make sure I know she sees what those 5 years actually cost me. Meg and I still go to therapy together every few months, not because our marriage is in crisis anymore, but because we both learned, the hard way, that love left unexamined can quietly curdle into resentment or invisibility without either person meaning for it to happen. We check in with each other now in ways we never used to, asking out loud whether the other person feels seen, feels heard, feels like a partner rather than a role. It is not a perfect marriage, because I don't believe perfect marriages exist outside of the stories we tell ourselves before we've actually lived through anything hard together. But it is an honest one now, in a way it perhaps wasn't before the cancer forced everything into the open, and in a stranger way, in a way I never would have chosen but have come to be grateful for nonetheless. I think that overheard conversation in the sunroom, as much as it broke something in me that day, ended up being the thing that finally taught both of us how to build something sturdier out of the pieces. If this story touched something in you, I want to ask you gently to sit for a moment with whoever came to mind while you were listening, whether it was someone you have cared for through an impossible season, or someone who cared for you when you had nothing left to give back, and I want to ask you, before you go, to leave a comment about what this story stirred up in you, about a lesson on love or forgiveness or the quiet cost of caregiving that you have carried in your own life, because these comments become their own kind of community, a place where people going through hard things can find each other and feel a little less alone. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey, because our family here believes, as I have come to believe through every hard year of my own marriage, that people can hurt each other without meaning to, and that the people who are willing to stay, to look honestly at the damage, and to do the slow unglamorous work of repair, are proof that love, real love, the kind that survives being tested, is always worth fighting for. I think often about the version of myself sitting frozen on that porch step 5 years into caring for the woman I loved, holding a broken coffee cup's worth of grief in his chest, certain that everything he had given had gone unseen. I wish I could tell that version of myself that the pain he was feeling was real and valid and did not need to be minimized, but that it was not, in fact, the end of the story. I wish I could tell him that the woman he married was capable of more growth than either of them yet knew, that the word that had wounded him so deeply would eventually become the very thing that taught them both how to love each other properly, fully, with open eyes instead of quiet, invisible sacrifice. I wish I could tell him that 5 years of being someone's servant, in her careless words, would in time become 5 decades, God willing, of being someone's true partner, seen and known and never taken for granted again. I cannot go back and tell him any of that. But I can tell you, whoever is listening today, wherever you are in your own hard season of loving someone through something enormous, that the story is not always over just because someone said something that broke your heart. Sometimes it is only the beginning of the truest chapter you will ever write together.